We heard this morning that elections can certainly impact policy, and we had a panel on that for those that were here about how the 2014 elections might impact what we might see out of D.C. over the next couple of years. This time we're going to kind of put that in reverse. We're going to discuss how policy can impact an election. And so basically, how will some of these energy issues, how will the RFS, how will these things impact what we're going to see over the next couple of years with the Iowa caucuses in early 2016 and with the general election in the fall of 2016? I know some people said it was Saturday, some event in Iowa was the official kickoff, but I really think this panel here is the official kickoff of the 2016 caucus campaign. And what we're going to do is have our panelists, I'm going to introduce them, and they're going to be able to speak briefly, and then we're going to ask some questions. I've got some questions I want to ask. We'll try to leave time at the end for one or two questions from the audience as well. Hopefully, some of yours were submitted ahead of time, so hopefully I'll cover a lot that you would want. First off, we have Dave Price. He's a political director and host of The Insiders and the weekend anchor at WHO TV, Channel 13 in Des Moines. I think Dave's probably spent more time covering presidential candidates than probably just about any other television reporter in the country, if not more than all of them. His work has been honored with a National Emmy, an Edward R. Murrow Award, and he's recently published his first book, Caucus Chaos, which I just got Grant Menke on our staff to buy me a copy of. And it talks about the journey of candidates through Iowa and through the wonderful tradition that we call the Iowa caucuses. So with that, I think we'll have you guys just stay there for logistical purposes. Please welcome Dave Price. And Dave, what do you want to say?
I didn't know we needed opening remarks.
Well, you don't have to. That leaves more time for questions. But if you have any thoughts, an anecdote, anything, you can...
I have no thoughts. I have one working leg. As you saw, as I limped my way up here, I tore something in my knee. So thanks to Monte for not making a stand, and I'll save all my other comments for as we get rolling. But thank you very much for the invite. It's great to be here.
All righty. Thank you. Next, let's see. To Dave's right is Craig Robinson. I don't know if that was a political statement or just a physical one. But yeah. Craig is the founder and editor-in-chief of the IowaRepublican.com, which is a political news and commentary website that is widely considered, kind of the go-to place, if you will, for insider news during GOP primaries, and certainly a place that gets a lot of traffic during general elections as well. Before doing that, Craig has done several things in politics, including he served as Steve Forbes' Southeast Iowa Regional Field Coordinator during the 1999 presidential campaign. And in 2007, Craig was actually the political director of the Republican Party of Iowa, where he was responsible for organizing the 2007 Iowa straw poll and later the 2008 First in the Nation Iowa caucuses. So he's seen this from several different angles throughout that. So Craig, do you have any opening remarks?
Sure, just some brief remarks. In my capacity as someone who covers the caucuses, I'm always amazed at the amount of time I spend talking to national journalists. And I'm kind of excited to be on this panel because I get questions all the time about renewable fuels and the importance to our caucus campaign. And so I think this is a very worthwhile discussion that we're going to have here this afternoon.
All righty, thank you. I hope so too. We'll hope to have a little fun as well. And then finally, I want to introduce to Craig's right, boy, that doesn't sound correct, does it? Is Norm Sterzenbach. Norm is a principal at Groundswell Public Strategies. Prior to that, he served as the executive director of the Iowa Democratic Party, overseeing the 2008 precinct caucuses. I believe you've done a couple other stints at the party. Norm has also spent more than 15 years working across the country, not only in Iowa, but across the country for various campaigns for Congress, for governor, Senate, president, and so brings a wealth of knowledge of how these things play out. So, Norm?
Again, just to echo what everybody else said, thanks for the invitation. I agree with Craig, believe it or not, that this is an incredibly important issue, not only for our state, but for our country. So I think it's It's an important discussion, and I'm happy to be here to have it. I also just want to say, on a personal note, Craig and I actually worked very closely together in the 2008 caucuses. I was at the Iowa Democratic Party, Craig was at the Republican Party of Iowa, and it was our responsibilities to put on the First in the Nation caucuses. So it is one of those areas where it's not just lip service. Republicans and Democrats really do work very closely together to make sure that Iowa is showcased very, very well in our caucus process. So it's a pleasure to be here with him as well.
Well, maybe, and hopefully you can probably keep that. I think I'm wired up over here. Before we get into some of the heavy-duty policy stuff, maybe we can have a little fun here. I like predictions. You guys probably don't like to make predictions. But who's running? Who's not running? Who might be running that is a front runner? Who might be running that's a dark horse? Is there anything on the field? Will we have a competitive, let's start there. Will we have a competitive Democrat Iowa caucus, meaning more than one candidate?
Well, I'll say that predictions on that front on my side are pretty easy. I think we are going to have Hillary Clinton is going to run for president. I'll go out on a limb and say that. She will have some competition in Iowa. Bernie Sanders has been to the state several times. Former Governor Martin O'Malley has been to the state several times, and it's just in the news this morning that exploratory committee, and he's got a couple of key staffers that just happen to live in Iowa randomly. So I think we'll have some action on our side, but this is really Hillary Clinton's campaign to lose. I'll go out on another limb and say that Hillary Clinton will win the Iowa caucuses.
All right. Well, you heard it here first. It's over. You all go home. No one has to turn out if you're a Democrat. Craig, will we have more than one Republican candidate?
Absolutely. I was going to say who's not running on the Republican side. I mean, it seems to change constantly in terms of more and more names get added to the list. I think that there will be surprises, though. I always like to remind people that everyone's running for president until they're not. Just in the last cycle, I always kind of like to remind people of some of the names of presidential candidates that you totally forget. For example, Mississippi Governor Haley Barbour was running for president. He actually employed Iowans. And, I mean, his campaign lasted just a brief time. But, I remember seeing the placard on the wall. So even when they get to that level and someone's like, they're definitely running, look, I almost went to work for a guy. I was convinced he was running, and then he didn't.
Who was that?
Who was that?
Can you say?
It was Bill Frist,
okay.
The senator from Tennessee.
Yeah.
And so everyone's running until they're not. And so even though there's all this movement, I think we'll see some surprises, and I think we could see some big surprises of big names, especially maybe names in Iowa that are significant, that maybe they look and sound like presidential candidates today, but when it comes time to actually make a choice to be a formal candidate, maybe they'll opt not to.
It's always easier to walk up to the edge of the cliff than to jump. Dave, you cover this quite a bit. You talk to media folks from all over. What's your take on what insight might you bring on who might be in, who might be out?
I think it's fascinating to just at least, and granted we're almost exactly a year out here, providing that no other state tries to jump ahead of us here and we stick to February 1st next year. But I think it's fascinating, especially with these guys and what they've started to talk about here. If you look about the feel, Norm has no problem saying that Hillary Clinton's going to be his party's nominee, and not one person is surprised that he said that. And whereas on Craig's side here, we were both at the same event on Saturday, so Congressman Steve King had this Iowa Freedom Summit over at Hoyt Sherman, which was a third of the building of what they probably really needed for as many people who wanted to get in there. But they gave us this schedule as we walked in there, and it had all the speakers on there, and there are a gazillion names on there. So I was going through there person by person, and I counted up, of all the people who claim they have serious interest in running for president, I counted 12 names, all in one place.
I think there were like 2 or 3 more that.
Yeah, and that's without Marco Rubio, Mitt Romney, Rand Paul, Bobby Jindal, and Jeb Bush, all of whom will likely run. maybe we throw out maybe one or something, but I mean, that's insane. So you're looking at 14, 15, 16 people. Now, granted, some of those people on the list, you had Sarah Palin on the list, who probably didn't do herself any favors with that speech she gave Saturday.
Well, let's go there. Who?
She's still going. She's still talking.
I think she did great.
Norm thinks that was the best speech ever.
For the Republican
Out of
Party.
Saturday's Republican powwow, we'll ask Dave who the winners and losers were, because he's our non-biased media observer. To be nice to Craig, I'll ask Craig who the winners were, and to serve up the softball to Norm, I'll say, Norm, who was the losers?
Oh.
So
I think they all come in there probably with different objectives, if you want to say. I mean, Rick Santorum, the room already knew him. Mike Huckabee, the room already knew him. So, and I know Craig already agrees on this because I read a piece he wrote on it. But so if you look at Wisconsin's Governor Scott Walker, the knock against him is that he's boring, and he'd be a snoozer to listen to. So he gets out there and lit the place up. He talked a lot about what he's accomplished. He threw out some red meat kind of things, that he took on the unions and such and survived a recall back in Wisconsin. And he told a story about all of the threats he gets. And that's when, and I'm a big people watcher, which drives my wife nuts. But anyway, I love watching people. But anyway, when Walker was given his speech, and there were about 1,200 people in there or whatever, people were just hanging on his words when he was talking about the threats that he and his family received through the recall and through some of the battles with the unions that he did out there. And there were, very personal, awful things that some people are saying to him, talking about assassination and all this stuff. And he's talking about one in particular when he was talking about somebody threatened to gut his wife like a deer. And when he said it, you could hear the crowd go, oh. And they all have their canned one-liners and that stuff, so we're used to those kind of reactions, but people were hanging on that story, and he delivered it very well, and he just really connected with people. So I thought he was probably almost a runaway winner, providing what he had to try to accomplish. Donald Trump tried to give himself some credibility that, that he's serious. We had an interview with him that we ran Sunday and Monday, and I got a lot of hate email for it saying that, what are we doing wasting people's time and, whatever.
especially after he fired.
He fired Sean Johnson,
Yeah,
exactly.
firing Sean
Celebrity
Johnson
apprentice.
right before you go to Iowa. I don't know.
But,
I
he
mean,
claims he's
not
serious.
sure that's the
and
political
he
judgment
says
we
it's
want in the White
different
House.
now because his kids can take over the company, and his show on NBC is about to run its course, perhaps. But so I'm not going to say he was the big winner, but he probably came in with a different objective. But Walker was out there and clearly accomplished what he was trying to do. Carly Fiorina, who most Iowans have never heard in person before, it was a different kind of speech. You didn't have people maybe hanging on her every word in the same way you did with Walker, but then she was one of the few people, along with Sarah Palin, who came hard after Hillary Clinton, which shows what I know about this. I actually thought Clinton would be the punching bag throughout the whole day, and most people completely stayed away from her. They are still ripping on President Obama, and I thought they'd probably move ahead to that, and I'd be curious what you think of that.
Craig,
but Fiorina got a great, she tore into Hillary Clinton, the crowd loved it, and probably put her on the map, at least for now.
Craig, any other winners out of that? Or you could go losers, but I won't make it.
Well, thank you, Dave. Or Monte, sorry. I always caution people that in the world that we live in with the 24-hour media, we make everything that happens so important. It's critical. It almost as if the caucuses themselves, which are a year away, were won and lost based on someone's performance in Des Moines on Saturday. And so I actually thought I spent 10 hours there on Saturday. I went home and actually watched the speeches and the press conferences again, because that's what I do. And
I think
anyway,
paid to do
I
that,
thought Rick
right?
Santorum made a really good point where he says, look, I didn't win the Iowa caucuses by going to these big multi-candidate events and giving great speeches. He won it very differently, and I think we need to remember that. And as I watched everything unfold on Saturday, I thought there was two classes of candidates. I thought there were the new fresh faces, and I think there were the people that we have gotten to know that have run for president before. And I think on Saturday, there was a disadvantage for those who had run for president before, because I don't care what they say, Mike Huckabee and Rick Santorum, I've seen them 1,000 times. And it's going to be hard for them to wow me, to impress me, and to say something completely different that would, invoke some sort of different reaction. Whereas I've seen Scott Walker give 3 speeches before, but never a real political speech. And so I think the bar was a little bit lower for fresh faces. But the thing that I also watched is it was kind of the old dogs, the guys who had run before, who took time when they came to Iowa. They didn't just fly in, give a speech, and leave. Rick Santorum spent 5 days here, and in such, he went to 3 media markets. He got great media coverage, and he's doing all the things that made him successful 4 years ago. And so I cautioned Kevin, the guy who writes with me. I said, hey, we're not going to call anyone a loser. It's too early to be a loser. We can say who did well and explain that. And I'm glad we didn't, because as I look at these trips, Rick Perry went and did 2 other events, and I thought they were very good political events for him. And so I don't think we should, just look at one thing a candidate does while they're in town. I think we need to look at the whole trip and then judge, was it worth it? What did they get out of it? And so there's a lot of different people who accomplished a lot in Iowa this week.
All right, well, I'll return the favor the other direction, but Norm, here's your chance. A lot of Republicans, a lot of red meat. From the Democrat perspective, what did you guys see on Saturday?
Well, I'll be honest, I took advantage of the beautiful day and took down Christmas lights and really didn't watch it. I did read some of the coverage, I read some of Craig's coverage, watched some on TV. The one thing I'll say, I will avoid talking about the losers, although one can say that Sarah Palin and Donald Trump probably were more distractions than they were advancing the cause of Republican politics that day. But what I will say is that events like that showcase that the winners really are Iowa, and the fact that you've got all of this attention, all of these candidates and all this media attention coming to the state to talk about the future of our country. And I think while I have obviously a very, very different perspective than the host, Steve King, and everybody that was on that stage, I can appreciate the magnitude of the event that happened on Saturday, and I think it's really a great thing for our state. I will agree with Craig, though, having watched a lot of caucus campaigns over the years, that speeches come and go by and large. Most of our presidential candidates don't win or lose based on speeches, although you can, particularly on our side of the aisle, you can pick a couple of moments. Barack Obama in 2007 at the Jefferson-Jackson dinner, for example, where they sort of break out later in the campaign. But caucuses aren't won or lost based on speeches. They're won or lost on the ground, and who works the activists across the state better. And so it's great to hear Craig say that. Obviously, he understands how politics work in this state. And it really is. The candidates that fly in and fly out to give a speech probably aren't going to be all that successful. But the ones that are traveling the state, getting into small communities, identifying precinct captains, volunteers, and actually building an organization and building lists, those are the ones that are going to make waves on caucus night. So that's really, in the long term, what you need to watch out of events like this. I agree.
Okay, so now you've heard about the potential fields, some of what it takes to win. Let's shift a little bit more to the focus of this summit, which is energy policy, renewable fuels. We announced last week this new group, America's Renewable Future. It's bipartisan. Eric Branstad's involved. A guy named Derek Eden, who's been very involved with Barack Obama's activities, are kind of co-heading it up. And their goal is to make RFS one of those top issues that candidates coming to Iowa have to deal with. Do you see that effort having the potential to be successful? And if so, in terms of getting candidates, not letting them kind of just slide by with wiggle words. Not that a candidate would ever do that. I would never do that. And if so, how do you see the RFS playing?
Well, I'll take that to start. I think that this effort that was announced a week ago is incredibly important. And I know there was an effort the last time, maybe not as significant as this one will be, but I just kind of look back at caucus history. My first campaign was in 1999, and it was George W. Bush and Steve Forbes and some others. And John McCain skipped the state. And it was largely known he skipped the state because, he didn't agree with Iowans on renewable fuels. I also remember there was a popular TV show back then called The West Wing. I remember this episode where it was all about ethanol, right? How you got to come to Des Moines and kiss the ring. King Corn is the name of it, yeah. And I remember the episode, and and I worked for a campaign that Steve Forbes was pro renewable fuels, and we used to brag about the campaign bus was run on biodiesel, and so I always came from my family's not farmers, but I was always proud of the ethanol effort in Iowa just growing up here. And I worked in politics, and I saw how important that issue was. And then suddenly, I think over time, that notion became challenged. And we saw it, and McCain tried to campaign and work Iowa in 2008 for a number of reasons. It didn't work. I don't think it was necessarily the renewable fuels issue that drove him out. But again, when the national media is reporting on it, they'll throw it in there. They're not going to forget. But the other thing that we saw in the last cycle, I think really kind of disturbed me as someone who's been, pro-renewable as long as I've been around, is that, Tim Pawlenty, a governor of a Midwest state, came to Iowa and gave a speech and was very tough on ethanol subsidies. And the national media they raved about this. This isn't just a speech Tim Pawlenty gave. This was his official campaign announcement in Des Moines. And the news media said, look at this tough guy. He's willing to say the tough things.
Courageous.
He's courageous, I think, is how they explained it. And so I think that is it kind of, and then as the Republican Party kind of tended to be a little bit more libertarian in nature, Republicans don't typically like mandates. They don't like subsidies and all this stuff. And I think this has all kind of creeped in and really created a toxic atmosphere among Republican activists towards the renewable fuel industry. And so I came to this conference 4 years ago. There was only 2 Republican presidential candidates who addressed you guys.
One of them won the state. I just want to put that
right,
on the record.
and one of them won the state.
Which time?
In the caucus.
The caucus.
Which night?
Yeah, later.
The first time or the second?
The official night.
But and Mitt Romney supported it as well. But I bring all that up because I do think that while we're in Iowa, and I think by and large we all know how important renewable fuels are, there's a lot of political activists on my side that really struggle with it, and so it creates an environment where these presidential candidates come in and get helmet stickers for being rough on an industry that, frankly, I don't think they understand. I was interviewing a presidential candidate on Saturday, and as I waited in the hallway to go meet with them, his staffer said, "Hey, Craig, do you think this RFS thing is important?" And I said, well, obviously, if they're asking me, they've heard about it. And I said, yeah, it is important, and it's an issue. I look at it, and reporters ask me all the time about renewable fuel issues, and I always tell them it's like, for me, it's a test on, do you really understand Iowa? Do you understand Iowa's economy? Do you understand that this isn't just, a subsidy question, a yes or no? This is about our economy. And I get really frustrated with the RFS thing. And to be honest with you, and I think there's a lot of Republicans that don't want to acknowledge this either, we had a big issue in our Republican U.S. Senate campaign where we had candidates who they flip-flopped on the issue. I reported it. I covered that. We only had one of the 4 major credible candidates that initially supported the RFS. To me, that's surprising, especially when one who flip-flopped was a legislator. It tells me that there's more work to be done on the issue, and they think that it's a mandate. And to be honest with you, it's all about market access. And to me, it's troubling that people don't understand the issue or even want to take the time to understand the issue.
Let's go to Dave. How do you see them handling the RFS or different ways? Will it impact? Will it resonate?
A couple different things. First, I want to know from Craig who this staffer was, of course, the reporter in me, because you may not like the candidate as much after Craig probably tells us. Yeah, or not, yeah. A couple things about this interest me as an observer here. That this bipartisan effort will be fascinating to watch to see what kind of play it gets both in our state but with the national media, and then how the candidates either embrace it, run from it, or try to not answer questions about it. Obviously, you have some very well-known names part of it so far with Eric and Derek, which will bring a lot of credibility to the effort. And this bipartisan movement was probably a masterstroke to give it a little more oomph as we go through this. I'll just tell you, we talked to, so you heard from Rick Santorum this morning, and then we talked to him afterwards, and we were talking to him about RFS. And the way I would look at Craig's side of the fence here on the Republican field, because at least early on, and I totally agree with Craig, that everybody who's thinking about running for president is running for president until they decide they can't win and they drop out. So even though we ask them the stupid questions of all the time about when are you going to run, all this, they're all running or they wouldn't be here. And they're out there seeing if they can have the support and the money to keep going. But frankly, they're all running or they wouldn't go through this. Having said that, so as we assess, especially the Republican side, when you're looking at 12, 15 people, for me as a reporter, I need to find issues that there's some separation on here. And this would appear to be one of those issues. So the case in point for me is the two candidates I've talked to in the last 48 hours, 72 hours, whatever it is. I talked to Rick Perry on Sunday and then the other Rick Santorum here today. They clearly have very different language when they discuss the RFS. So for me as an observer, I want to see then how this issue plays out. So because it's such a ginormous potential field here, we are going to be looking for those issues that help separate them, and they need to find issues to separate. Clearly, that's why Santorum's here today. So he can separate himself from Rick Perry, Ted Cruz, some of the others here early on. And you mentioned, will this do any good? Can this stand out? I mean, I think a couple of things with that. It's going to come down to the activism of those who believe in this. But also I'm curious about, since you all are getting out so early on this, as you know, once we get closer here, we're going to get so many more of these outside groups, super PAC influenced, whatever they are, where we're going to have so many different movements out there pulling people in different directions. And if you all are out there early, you know, maybe that gives you an early heads up, an early head start.
Okay. Norm, on the Democrat side, do you see there being potentially separation on the RFS, and how some of the, we don't know if they'll run, or like you said,
Right.
They're all kind of running, but some of the names that you tossed out earlier?
On the Democratic side, we love mandates, we love government regulation, we love big government. So I think it would be.
I did tell you this will be up on YouTube, right? I just want to make sure. All right.
And of course, I speak for every Democrat in the world. But no, I think that on the Democratic side, I think that you'll find a lot of support for the RFS, for the EPA. I don't think it'll be. The question will really be whether or not the candidates actually take a position on it. And by candidates, I really mean whether one candidate takes a position on it. And I don't mean that in a bad way. It's more of whether or not the campaign dynamics require the front runner to actually have to take a position on potentially difficult issues. Dave mentioned, or whether or not they don't answer the question. And I think that's really more on our side as to whether or not, because every time you take a position on something, there's somebody opposed to it. And so if you don't have to, why would you? Particularly if it's not necessary in order to advance the politics in a particular state. So I think that's actually one of the areas where this particular organization could be very interesting to watch. I mean, I can't speak to Eric Branstad, but Derek Eden is one of the best political operatives that we have on in our party, and I think it's fantastic to have him involved in this effort. He's going to he'll make sure that the program is done very well, and if anybody can get an answer out of Secretary Clinton, I imagine that he'll be able to put a program in place to be able to get it. So I'm excited to see that, and I do think that I agree that because this issue is so important to Iowans, and because you guys it's going to be a well-funded operation with good people behind it, it will likely have a major impact on the race. The question that I have, though, at the end of the day is whether or not support for a caucus goer who wins the Iowa caucuses is related to this particular issue or not. Will it be a factor in the campaign? Of course it will be. I don't see any reason why it won't be. But whether or not that will actually translate to this candidate wins because of it or this candidate loses because of it is really a function of the organizing effort that this group and others do around the issue, and whether or not you can actually get people to show up to the caucus and say, I'm going to support this candidate because they support that, or I'm not going to support this candidate because they don't support the issue. That's going to be the real test.
I think one of the goals of the group will be to try to have as many people who leave Iowa as viable candidates be pro-RFS as possible. It doesn't have to be one that wins. Now, I'm going to throw out a pet idea of mine and then have you guys tell me how wrong I am. We always talk about the Iowa caucuses. It's first, but in theory, if you're running for president, you don't want to just win the Iowa caucuses and win the nomination. You actually want to then go ahead and win a general election in November and become president. And so I've thought it's a mistake for a campaign and some of the staff and whatever that try to come talk to you, hey, how's this issue, to focus on it exclusively as a caucus issue. Because I could conceive a way where a certain person who's anti-RFS, and if there's 8 or 10 people that actually run on the Republican side, could put together a plurality to win Iowa and be anti-RFS. But I remember when we did this 4 years ago, we were going to put out a voter guide to 10,000 Iowa households that are invested in or employed by renewable fuels. And I kept telling them, it's going to print, it's going to print. And we delayed that a day at the request of the Romney campaign because he had to go to Sioux City and make a speech where he said he supported the RFS because they wanted to have the X in the right column. I don't think that had anything to do with their caucus strategy. I think it had everything to do with wanting to win Iowa in the general election. So is this not just a caucus issue? As Iowa is a purple state, a swing state, should it also be something they view longer term? And I'll let whoever wants to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a general election issue. And I think campaigns who only want to focus in the most narrow way and try to only appeal to conservative activists are making a huge mistake. This is an issue that our entire congressional delegation supports. This is an issue that our governor goes out and supports. And so I think it becomes very difficult. I view it as Republicans would be handing a huge issue over to Democrats in a general election, which I think is a huge mistake, especially when you realize that for a Republican to win statewide in the state, to win Iowa's 6 electoral votes, they're probably going to have to really roll up the vote in rural Iowa. And that's where this issue, I think, really comes home. And so I mean, we saw what Joni Ernst did in the U.S. Senate campaign, where she worked her tail off to make sure and to convince people that she was on the right side of this issue. And I think had she not done that, I think it would have been a wedge issue in the general election that really mattered. Had she kind of just kept her initial position intact, I think it's something that Congressman Braley could have used to kind of create a wedge between her and rural Iowa voters. And so I don't know if that would have, how big that would have changed things, but I think it would have mattered. It would have changed the conversation. And so I hope that when you look at a presidential race, you'll see all these national polls of who's up, who's down. National polls don't matter. They don't matter in the primary, and they don't matter in the general election, because that's not how we elect a president. Electoral college matters, and Iowa is one of 5 to 7 states that really matters. And for any Republican presidential candidate to take that issue and basically to give it away and say, I don't want to talk about 47,000 jobs that are in Iowa that are employed in this industry, I think is a huge mistake and would be I'm afraid it would be a fatal blow.
Norm or Dave, anybody want to add anything?
I think we'll make it a fatal blow. If Republicans don't want to embrace the issue, I think from the Democratic side we'll definitely use it. It was an issue in 2012 against Mitt Romney. It was an issue against Joni Ernst. She did a good job of positioning herself in the right place, but that didn't stop it from being on television. Right. Based on her previous comments on it. So I think it will be an issue in the general election no matter what. I doubt it won't be the single defining issue that wins or loses a state, but in a close election when you're looking at every vote, you can't afford to take those kinds of risks. So I think I would agree that candidates need to position themselves when they come out in the caucus campaign thinking about the general election in Iowa. But the other thing, the other calculation, though, that some of these candidates are going to be making is not just what happens in Iowa, but what happens in other places. For example, Rick Perry and Ted Cruz and Bobby Jindal still have to go back home, win or lose, and I'm not sure that this particular issue is popular in their home states. So that can be a factor.
Worked okay for W.
He went home victorious.
Well, that helps too.
So we'll see. So they do. This issue plays differently, obviously, in other states, and so every presidential candidate is going to have their strategy. In Iowa, support for the RFS is an absolute no-brainer. It is one of the easiest political calls you can make in the state. So I think the only reason to be opposed to it is if you actually are opposed to it. So.
I like that. That's a good political statement if I ever heard one. I like that.
Not that that's how people make their decisions.
Of course not, but I might have to steal that line. Dave?
I forgot, my boss would want me to point out that Rick Perry will talk about the RFS on our Sunday morning show at 9:30 on Channel 13. That aside.
What channel was that?
Yeah, Channel 13. On the Democratic side, I think it'll be interesting to watch for me both on this issue and many others. So you mentioned Martin O'Malley and Jim Webb. So you have two East Coast guys here. Is this just one of the issues? I don't frankly know enough about their backgrounds to know where they even are on this yet. Is this something that do they go all out here and campaign like crazy to try to force Secretary Clinton to play here? But do they pick this as one of those issues to try to win over some folks, but then not only get her to play here, but to take a stand on this? And until somebody really pushes here, now maybe it'll be all the activists will force some of this to happen too, but I would argue, and Norm may disagree with me, but on the Democratic side, unless somebody, whether it's one or two people, or Bernie Sanders, I guess if he decides to run as a Democrat, since he's not technically a Democrat, if they can put together a real campaign, whoever the heck it is, one or two or three of them, to force her to play here, I think that opens up a whole other possibility of pushing this issue. But I might be wrong, but if none of those other folks can put any kind of credible campaign together, she's not going to be here to begin with. So she'll come here, I assume, and just give a couple of big speeches every once in a while just to keep everybody fired up. But I can't imagine, selfishly as a reporter, I can't imagine getting a lot of sit-down time with her to try to grill her on some of these issues, because if her attention's going to be elsewhere.
Right. Well, I think so. There's several issues there. I think personally, and Craig and I were talking about this earlier. If I were advising Secretary Clinton, my strong advice to her would be to play pretty hard in Iowa, mainly because, well, for two reasons. One, she's got a perceived national Iowa problem because she didn't win the Iowa caucuses in 2008. I say perceived because that's actually not really the case in the Democratic Party in Iowa.
She didn't have a lot of great things to say about Iowa, though.
No, but she's polling pretty well. So
Agreed.
I don't think any comments that she's said in the past about Iowa have resonated with rank-and-file Iowa caucus goers on the Democratic side. But the other issue, the more important issue, I think, is the fact that it's a general election swing state, and the more work she does now will pay off in the general election, particularly when there's a fight. Some could say for the soul of the party on the Republican side, and there will be a lot of activity. We wouldn't want to cede that ground to the Republicans for the entire year. So I would advise her to spend some time here, but certainly could understand a situation where she didn't, unless she perceived a real threat here. And that's really going to be up to those presidential candidates to be able to do that. If Secretary Clinton leaves an opening that she doesn't support the RFS, I think it could be a real wedge issue that somebody could take off. I think the more likely scenario in my mind would be that any of the candidates that really try to do that, it's a pretty simple fix on her end to just say, no, I support the renewable fuel standards, and then that's kind of the end of that.
Over with.
That's the end of that particular debate. And there's probably other areas that she's less likely, where they can draw a contrast that she's less likely to take the leftist position on. But only time will tell. But I would foresee that she is supportive of this issue if you can get her on the record on it.
So one of you mentioned earlier that, maybe it was Craig, that on the Republican side, obviously, a lot of candidates will be running as conservatives, free market, smaller government, less government, that sort of thing. And so, in some ways, that makes a pro-RFS stance harder. But I have to tell you, one of the things I think, now maybe it's because I'm in an echo chamber of renewable fuels, so this is why you're here. One of the things that I think could potentially resonate in rural America is when, I don't know if you guys were here this morning, I had a chart up where there's all these things from mandates to tax credits to loan guarantees for pipelines to military support, all this. And basically, the renewable fuels industry gets, right now, the RFS. And the oil industry gets all of these other things. And so, I think a big part of what this will be is to hold people accountable for, I hate to use the word, but hypocrisy. Where if you're going to say, well, we can't have a biodiesel tax credit because that's the government picking winners and losers, but then you go to the Koch brothers confab this weekend and twist yourself in a pretzel trying to explain why oil subsidies aren't subsidies, they're just tax expenditures, whatever that is. I think it's the same thing. Anyway, what's your thoughts on how, as there is certainly going to be I'll be quiet, but there's a certain subset that's going to want to be seen as pretty ideologically pure. And I think that they're really going to have a real weakness if Iowans hold them accountable.
Well, and I think that Iowans really have to, if you share Monte's mindset, I think you really have to go out and push back against everything else that you're hearing. Because 4 years ago, my website, we conducted a traditional statewide caucus poll of Republicans. And it's done by a reputable pollster. He was George W. Bush's pollster. And the results that we asked this question following Tim Pawlenty's announcement. And so, I mean, the results should really worry you. And I was shocked at what they said in Iowa. I mean, they said that 47% of respondents, just Republicans, had a positive opinion of a candidate who ends supporting ethanol subsidies. 47%. We're not talking anymore about just activists. We're talking about a big group of people. And, furthermore, I think it was, when asked what type of candidate they were more likely to support, 56% of Iowans said they're more likely to support someone who opposed ethanol subsidies. That tells you the amount of work that needs to be done. And by the way, I mean, maybe it's not a coincidence that what else was happening in 2011 in Iowa? Well, the American Petroleum Institute was spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in the state, having their Iowa Energy Forum across that played big in the Iowa straw poll. They spent lots of money to advance their causes and to really, I think, quiet this cause. And so, I would expect that that's going to happen again. I mean, I was shocked. I mean, the American Petroleum Institute advertised on my website. They had billboards.
How did you sleep at night?
I'm a capitalist. But, I mean, I was driving to Ames, where the straw poll was going to be, and there's a giant billboard that had it was a beautiful farm scene, combine, and it was all about the Iowa Energy Forum. And I kind of chuckled. I'm like, I bet you most people don't realize that this is the big oil industry, trying to confuse, I think, the issues in this state. And that's why this new effort, I think, is so important, because you got to push back, because if you don't, all these candidates who are already opposed to the RFS are just going to be emboldened to keep those positions.
I think it's context is key for us, because if the question was, do you support a candidate who wants to end ethanol subsidies while leaving in place 102 years of oil subsidies, hopefully you get a different answer.
And that's why.
But they don't hear that other side
Right.
unless we all get the other side out there. I want to give you guys a chance to ask each other questions, but was there any other thoughts on our last topic? Or Norm, you want to go first? Or ask me a question, not ask me a question, but throw a question out for the panel to talk about? Anyone? Dave, you're a reporter. You're always supposed to have questions at the ready. So otherwise I can ask, how do you think climate change will play? I'll throw that out as maybe that's a little more on the Democrat side, but it's interesting to see. Dave, you've talked as a reporter. There's a lot of issues where, primaries are interesting because there's usually a lot of issues where you agree. Right. And so sometimes, even though the issue might not be seen as that important by the candidates or the party, if it's an issue where you disagree, it gets a lot more outsized attention. We're starting to see some different nuances within the Republican ranks on how they talk about climate change. I assume we'll see a little bit more unanimity on the Democrat side, but Dave, do you want to maybe address what you think?
Yeah, I want to back up before climate change. I think what I would watch from the effort that you all are trying to do is how strong this will be. There are a lot of groups that I can remember over the years, they get a lot of fanfare for a press conference, and that'll put them on the 6 o'clock news that night. It'll get them in the Des Moines Register, etc. And the question is, though, the staying power of it. So you can get it, and you have big names part of this, obviously, which will help, and a lot of credibility that's added to it. So it gets that credibility in our state. But just looking back of all of these I've covered so many groups. A lot of times a group will bring in a well-known guest, and they're the launch for this, whatever the big issue of the caucus is going to be. And there are just so many. I mean, the battle to get the attention for these issues is just so big. So for me, what I would watch is the staying power and the staying energy power of the group and the supporters. You can be all charged up here as we sit here in January, but come June, July, and August, when people are taking their vacations and moving on with their normal parts of lives, I mean, what kind of force am I going to see as a reporter out there when I'm going to all of these events and candidate X is here and candidate Y, all those that are here? Am I going to see a presence here? I mean, are these candidates going to have to answer these questions because they have no choice? Because at groups like this with microphones set up and they say, okay, anybody have a question here? That's where you're going to feel the strength of this group, and that's where I think most of these groups fail, is that they have the hoopla at the beginning and it just kind of peters out. You don't see anything about them as we go through the cycle.
Craig, climate change?
You're not a scientist.
Or should I alleged?
Well, I'm not a scientist.
Alleged climate change?
No, I think I think that there's, in a Republican primary, I don't think there's going to be a robust debate and differences between the candidates, but I do think that, again, you have to acknowledge that, I know that if I'm fertilizing my yard, right, and I know if I don't apply it right, I could harm my piece of the environment that I own. And so I think that, look, the pollution, everything that man does have an impact on our environment. And if we don't acknowledge that as Republicans, I think we really start to discredit ourselves among the American people. I mean, I think that, is it the big, how much of an impact are we going to have? I think that's all debatable, but I think that if Republicans kind of continue this nonsense of whenever someone says climate change, we laughed and say, it doesn't matter what these scientists say. Look, I think it's more complicated than that, but I think it's just like so many other issues. We have to talk about an issue that I think most Americans, if not all, agree exists on some level. We do impact our climate. We do impact our planet with everything that we do. And so to not want to be part of a debate on that, I think is foolish.
I agree 100%.
Whether it exists and whether the government should take over the economy to do something about it would be the difference.
Is the difference.
Well, I think it would be very
side.
interesting if there was an actual policy discussion about it. If we could, if both sides could agree that there is that man is responsible for at least some portion of climate change. So we agree on that piece. So let's talk about how we're going to fix it and debate those issues, as opposed to debating whether or not it exists in the first place. Then, I mean, from my perspective, of somebody who cares deeply about politics, but also I'm in it for a particular reason because I support the issues behind those politics. That would be much more enjoyable for me to actually see some positive action instead of just the politics of whether it exists or not. But climate change will be an issue in the 2016 general election, just as it was in the 2014 election. On our side, it'll be interesting to see if Tom Steyer runs for U.S. Senate in California. That will change the amount of money involved in having that discussion.
Those of you that don't know, Tom Steyer is a billionaire who spent quite a little bit of his own money last year trying to make climate an issue in some of the targeted U.S. Senate races around the country.
And if he's running for U.S. Senate in California, I imagine his money will be spent in California as opposed to in Iowa and other places. But it will be part of the discussion. But I do hope that the discussion isn't about whether or not we agree on climate change, but whether or not we agree on how we're going to revert the causes of climate change and what role government has in that process. So I hope that's the case. But I'm not actually optimistic for 16 on that one.
We're about out of time, so if someone wants to run to a mic, Kevin running, an arm wrestle. Well, if you guys are, okay, now we're going to put you like on the clock. You know, you guys got to give nice answers. Now we're going to treat this like you're a candidate. You got 30 seconds to answer this really complicated question.
There is a strong reason why none of us are candidates.
So Kevin Ross, Western Iowa Energy, you're on the clock.
Yeah, appreciate you guys being here and being on the panel today. Question about super PACs. You know, the realm we're in today is in a new area in politics with super PACs being so they've changed the landscape. And I'd just like you to comment, if you guys could, quickly on how that changes things in the future. And you see things with super PACs almost to the point of slanderous, where they'll take a position or go after a candidate that is not. The candidate will say, hey, I had nothing to do with that commercial. I had nothing to do with that super PAC saying those things. But, there's supposed to be separation, but it's pretty cloudy. Just comment on that and how we are supposed to, use that area to our advantage and if we can or if it's just just there to deal with it.
As briefly as humanly possible.
Look, I think super PACs confuse the American voters. And I think that and I think they're confusing on both sides, and I think they can sometimes become unhelpful to the candidate that they're trying to help. I think there's a really easy solution to this, and that's these arbitrary campaign contribution limit numbers that we limit individuals on how much you can give your congressman or your senator or your person running for president. Just make it just disclose it immediately, who's given what to whom, and that way we don't have all this undisclosed money flowing into these groups that all sound like they're the same group, and then that way only the candidates are actually running these ads instead of 15,000 different super PACs.
I think that Craig is dead on the fact that super PACs confuse the voters. One of the things that in research from the 2014 election cycle that we've seen in Iowa, Colorado, and a few other states, at least on our side of the aisle, is that voters are so turned off by it, it's actually part of the reason why Democrats didn't show up. In some of these areas, it's not enough to impact the election, but it's clear that voters just tuned out, particularly the ones that we needed most in midterm elections. And I do think that long term, that's going to be the effect across the board. It's just lower turnout, and that's not good for anybody. So I think any steps that can be taken to make sure that the message that's coming out on these campaigns is coming from the candidates rather than from outside groups. The candidates will be better served, and the debate will be much better served.
Except they buy television ads. So yes. WHO is in favor of super PACs.
Actually, I don't think WHO actually gets most of that.
Yeah, that goes to corporate. Since we're lightning round, I'll do really fast. The reporter in me wants to know who's giving to what. I don't want anything shielded because that way we can try to follow the money and see if somebody's trying to influence something. And there's no doubt the super PACs can have a tremendous affect an impression on people, surely to the detriment of candidates, and of course it turns people off. And I think the media probably have to do a better job of truth-telling to get through what they're putting on our airs, our televisions, to let you know whether it's true or not.
All right, I think Rick was next, and then we'll come back over here if we're really quick.
Thanks, Monte.
Because I know there's people that want to know if they won those door prizes, so I don't want anyone to start throwing stuff at us.
Rick Schwartz, CEO, Absolute Energy. You know, I've heard you mentioning and drawing some correlations between lack of support for the subsidy 4 years ago to possibly support of ethanol. Well, that was the VTEC, and that subsidy was an oil subsidy. As CEO of Absolute Energy, I've yet to receive $1 from VTEC. And so the industry itself lobbied for the last 6 months to save that $3 billion, spend $500 million for infrastructure development, and $500 million back to the Treasury. The oil industry did not want it because they received that $3 billion. So, but to infer that we aren't going to go to the wall on the RFS because of that correlation, I think is incorrect, because that's our access to the consumer. And Monte, maybe you can share a little more on that.
Well, yeah, one of the interesting things, oh boy, I think I'd be brief. One of the interesting things when Governor Plenty came to Iowa and was getting credit for speaking truth to power by coming to Iowa and saying, I'm against the ethanol tax credit, I pointed out, and so there's at least a couple of stories, reporters who got it right. I pointed out, well, Senator Grassley has a bill to do that, and if Senator Grassley is trying to do that, then it's probably not all that crazy, because basically we had agreed to give up the tax credit in order to focus on the renewable fuel standard. And so Plenty, I actually give them a lot of credit. They said, hey, we could scam the national media who won't be diligent enough to actually figure out that this has already gone by. That when I say, hey, I'm for getting rid of the ethanol tax credit, well, so is the ethanol industry. I don't know. Any thoughts?
I actually wrote an article about that. If Tim Pawlenty wants, he's not as tough as he seems, because the ethanol industry is already where he was at. And so
but it did get national media. It was funny. Well, funny might not be the right word, but
sad.
Dave, you'd never let that happen, would you?
Never.
Okay.
Leave me for last, Marty.
Well, if you're last, you may not be on the list. Go ahead, Jim.
I'm a seasoned corn grower, and our family has substantial investment in the rural energy business. I'm not satisfied where my candidate for president is on renewable fuel standard, and I want to communicate with them. What key points can I make to them that would have the most influence on encouraging them to be strong on the renewable fuel standard and the support of ethanol?
Well, I think from my perspective, it's obviously I think the association will have good talking points for you, but the way that you want to have the most impact is it's coming from you, Iowan, in your community, and telling your story and how it affects you personally, rather than the industry and rather than the state. It's not going to be so much, at least on our side of the aisle, it's not going to be the statistics and the data that is going to have the most impact. It's going to be the personal story about you and your neighbors and your family and how that affects you. To put the personal touch on it.
And I agree. I mean, one of the things that I would encourage is, we talked about how you need to get involved in this effort, but I also think you just need to get involved in these races. And you have to show up. And so the most impactful thing you can probably do is when your candidate is in the area, you need to go to the event and you need to ask the question publicly, not privately. As someone who covers these candidates, I don't even roll tape during their speeches anymore, because I've probably heard it. There might be a variation on something. The most interesting thing to any reporter in this state is when someone walks up to the microphone and asks a candid question. And I would just say, when they're here, go find them, find a microphone, and ask the question as directly as possible. And then maybe that'll jar loose a conversation that can follow, that you can explain it to them better. But that is the only way, I think, that you can really change a candidate's position on something, is to do it, and to do it publicly and locally, because I think it's more powerful.
If a if a candidate has 5 town hall meetings in a day and they're early on in their caucus campaign and they get asked publicly about the renewable fuel standard, each one of those by different people who clearly are from that community, not the same little kid in a t-shirt that's paid to go to all 5 of those things, having been on the other side of it in my past life, I can guarantee you that candidate's going to be in the car to their staff saying, what is this RFS? I need a better answer.
Well, and the one thing I love about the Iowa caucus experience is that if you did that, if you showed up at a candidate's local event, asked the question, maybe there's a reporter from the New York Times there, maybe there's a reporter from the Wall Street Journal there. I bet you if you did that, they'd write a whole article on it, a whole article. And that's why participating matters and showing up matters. Even if you don't like the candidate, you should show up, especially if you dislike their position on this issue. Show up, be heard, because the reporters only cover what they see, and so you have to be seen, and thus you have to participate.
Dave, from a reporter's viewpoint on that, when you see this going on,
I just say reporters want real people. It doesn't matter if you're talking to Iowa reporters, national reporters. So an industry is great, but I agree with Craig that if you're there telling your personal story, and especially if you have the guts to stand up in front of a group and say, here's how it affects me, what are you going to do about it to the candidate? As a reporter, I observe that. You have a good chance that that's going to make it into the narrative for the day.
All right, at this point, we're going to take one last question. Before we do that, if someone can tell Grant Menke at the booth to no more signing up. If you didn't,
I think they're already here.
right there. Are they up here? Come on up on stage. Well, come on. We're not going to waste any more of your time. So come right up on stage. We'll do this in front of all of you, but go ahead. One last question.
My question is, would we do a better job of promoting ethanol if we promoted it for castrating pigs?
And on that note,
Apparently, yes, you would.
Norm, come on.
No, I think we laugh about it because it's funny, but it's an interesting point. The reason why the castrating pigs worked is because it was real and it identified with Iowans and it fit into the narrative that they were trying to tell. You can find a way to creatively tie the importance of renewable fuel standard to everyday real Iowans and the lives that they lead. That's how you're going to have the most impact.
I completely agree, and anytime you can put a interesting twist on something, you should.
I just say sometimes it pays to be different and be unique, and she did it in that ad, and you saw what happened.
Or sometimes it doesn't.
That's
I was
true.
actually in
being too unique could be bad.
I was actually in Washington, D.C. when that ad came out promoting renewable fuels with the group that was in D.C. doing Hill visits, and we got asked, oh my goodness, her campaign's over, this is horrible. And I said, I'm not there, so I can't get that, feedback. But I said, I can see this definitely going one of two ways. I said, call me in 2 days, and I'll tell you if she just lost the race or just won the race. And I mean, obviously, it's never one thing, but that was clearly one of those moments where it broke the right way for her. I wasn't sure in D.C. how that was going to break, but it worked. And we probably won't have any ads like that with our effort. But I think what you did here is when this group. Most of you are still here, so you either really want a dream vacation or you really care about renewable fuels. If you're in the latter part of that, we've got this group. Even if you didn't sign up in time to get in here, on your way out of the building, sign up at the booth to be part of America's renewable future. When we say, hey, a candidate's coming to your county, go there, ask. Don't wait to see if anybody else goes up to ask a question. Throw an elbow, well, maybe not an elbow, but get up there, get to that mic, be one of those 2 or 3 questions they take, be a part of the debate. It absolutely matters. With that, this was fun for me. I don't know if it was fun for you. I had a good time up here. Thanks, you guys. You guys are great. Thank you.